Let me begin this morning by saying a big thanks to this congregation. There's many reasons that the Vancouver School of Theology has to be grateful to you for, not the least of which the numbers of students that you keep on sending us, and long may it continue. I think this morning of Christine and Jill and Francis and Trevor and Rianne, just to name a few that immediately come to mind. Thank you for your partnership. We did a lecture series this past year in partnership with this congregation. But even more than that, did you know that you're now sharing your musician with us? Lonnie is now musician in residence at the Vancouver School of Theology, and as he does here, he has pumped it up for us. Thank you, too, for your minister, Beth, for her life and example, for her ministry in this congregation. From time to time, actually 3 times this past year, I have had woman students come to me and say, how can I be a good female minister? So I send them to good female ministers, to good ministers. And it's great to have Beth's ministry here in this congregation to send these students to learn from her a deeply faithful, relevant and engaging ministry that is taking place here. Every single church, every single organization I have ever known has at least one Martha. Thanks be to God for Martha. Martha is the patron saint of the church fellowship hall, of the community center. She knows where everything is because she put it there. Alongside of all of the pictures, that gallery of former ministers that we hang in the hall, there should also be a grand portrait of the Martha type. Somebody with a hammer in their hand, captured for a blurry moment as they move across the screen. They're really more suited to a sort of YouTube clip than they are to a picture. The church, the larger community, would be lost without its Marthas and Matthews, right? Because Martha is really a type. These people understand the importance of activity, of a good preparation, of diligence, of hospitality. Martha is the sister, the brother, who has our sympathy because, he and she are in the business of busyness, of getting on with it. They're people who don't like meetings that much. We're all men and women who take our responsibility very seriously. Most of us are up early. We work hard. We work into the night. Some of us are volunteers after work. We tackle impossible situations. We are always doing. And God knows, given the shape of our world, we need people who are doing important things. But like Martha, most of us are just doing what's expected of us. You see, hospitality in the ancient Near East was no casual affair. A surprise visitor was not so much a nuisance as it was a challenge. See, a rookie can whip up a feast for somebody you've invited, but only someone with Martha Stewart-like skill can get something ready for a surprise visitor, right? And so it is with us who have imbibed the wine of productivity, who believe in the Protestant work ethic. To the question, are you working hard or hardly working? We always say working hard. And have you noticed how that we've begun to exchange on the sidewalk that modern liturgical greeting? How are you? I'm so busy. Often rounded out with an itemized recitation of the things you've left to do, with a certain tone of exhaustion and a sense of our own indispensability. I have to say I love Martha. She's tightly wound, she's endlessly productive, she's on the move. I would hire her. Martha, she's the kind of person, if you ask her to do a job, it will be done, even if she has to kill people. Smart people ask Martha to chair the committee. Don't give another thought. Martha is on it, and she always does excellent work. The church relies on its Marthas and Matthews. Families rely on them. Whole societies rely on them. I guess that's why I'm a little squeamish about this reading for today. Jesus doesn't commend Martha. Jesus does not seem to know that the church, the community, needs people like Martha. Jesus appears, for all intents and purposes, to side with her lazy, unproductive, inefficient sister, Mary. Jesus commends not the one who stands and talks and gets busy, but the person who just sits there. Now, more than one reckless sermon has been preached on this text. I have sat where you are and heard them. I have listened as naive clergy chastise the busy Marthas of their congregations. Thoughtless words are directed at people without whom whole communities would be way less humane, way less effective, way less helpful. Unwary preachers from the beginning through church history have exalted contemplative Mary and downgraded bright-eyed, practical, multitasking Martha. Now, these readers of the Bible ignore the sage advice of the late Cambridge philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who once said, "We must not saw off the branch on which we sit." We all receive the benefits of Martha's work among us. The church needs Martha. I'm reminded of a story told by the late Alan Ferris, who was the principal of Knox College in Toronto. And when he was young, he was a student in Trail, British Columbia, a mining and smelting community. It was his first charge, and there he ministered to a working-class congregation. Well, life was not easy for Alan Ferris and his wife. They had no manse. They lived in this tiny little apartment, and somehow his wife had contracted typhoid fever. They had just had their first child, who had heart trouble, and proper health care was miles away. Well, one Sunday in the midst of all of that personal turmoil, he preached a sermon on this text from Luke. And he let Martha have it both barrels. He extolled the virtues of Mary, who sat and listened. He castigated the vice of hyperactive, crashing around in the kitchen Martha. Well, after he preached, he returned home. At the door of his apartment, there where he couldn't miss it, was a casserole. And on the casserole, there was a short 2-word note from Martha. Alan Ferris said, "I never preached on that passage quite the same way again." Now, there's so much to commend Martha to us. It was great. Our reader for this morning mentioned that it comes right after, the story of the Good Samaritan. Somebody asks Jesus, "What's the greatest commandment?" And he says, "Love God and love your neighbor." We've just heard a story, love your neighbor and love God. Luke places them together. It's critically important. See, it'd be easy to breeze through here, read the Mary and Martha story and conclude we should all just sit in cozy comfort at Jesus' feet and a warm-hearted retreat from a world in deep need. Did you notice how the story of the Good Samaritan gives you a push in the other direction? It's a call to action, to movement, to love people on the margins. Martha's just being a good Samaritan. She does her faith. Her faith gets traction in the world. Martha knows that text from James. Faith without works is dead. So she does things. She busies herself. She gets it done. After all, she's the one who welcomes itinerant Jesus when he shows up unannounced at the door. And so we've got to ask, what's Jesus up to here? Mary, he says, she chose the good portion, the one thing needful. Martha, calm down, sit down. Mary's doing the right thing, not you. I have noticed in this short story that Martha never gets a chance to respond. Luke holds the microphone for the interview, right? But I wonder what kind of conversation she might have had with Luke had she seen his final redaction of the gospel. I can just imagine Martha's complaint. Now, Luke, listen. Didn't you just have Jesus tell a story about like a good Samaritan? Wasn't he the hero of that tale? Luke, do you remember how that one ended with these words? You reported that Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." So why am I the villain? Luke, first you say don't just sit there, do something. Now you're telling us don't just do something, sit there. So which is it? And which is it for us? Well, what if we look at this story slightly differently? Many of you will know that in 1939, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited Canada. They went right across the country by train. In the middle of the night, the train made a stop in the northern Ontario town of Chapleau, a little town to take on water. The mayor of that town, even though it was 2 o'clock in the morning, said he'd like to meet the king. And George VI, obliged, emerged on the platform. And when he met the mayor, he said, "Don't you have one of those gold chains of office?" And the mayor said, "Oh, yes, I have one of those, but I only wear it on special occasions." At Mary and Martha's home, it is a special occasion. A moment of gravity arrives in person. Mary grasps the fact, sits at his feet, hangs on his words. She receives what Jesus has to give her. Martha, in a flurry of activity and anxiety and possibly resentment, misses the chance. You see, it's not that our work is unimportant. It's not that Jesus doesn't appreciate us. He knows, I think, that without the Marthas and Matthews and Mikes and Moiras of this world, society would fall apart. But in this passage of Scripture, it's a matter of priorities. And there's a kind of rhythm here, isn't there? For disciples of Jesus, worship punctuates work. We've got to breathe in the love of God if we're going to meaningfully exhale the love of God to a world in need. We've got to sit and listen if we're going to be part of God's mission to the world. Why? Because, well, I have noticed that the active life without a worship life breeds a resentful life. In a recent edition of the Atlantic magazine, Michael Sandel, a political philosopher at Harvard, offered an article called "The Case Against Perfection." In the article, Sandel reflects upon our performance-obsessed culture. He makes the interesting observation that the recreational drugs of the 1960s and 70s have been replaced in our day with performance-enhancing drugs. He says the choice of drugs today are not for checking out, but for buckling down. Not for beholding the world and taking it in, but for molding the world and fitting in. He says steroids and stimulants figure in the enhancement debate. They're not a source of recreation, but they're part of our attempts to meet the bid for compliance, a way of our competitive society's demand to improve our performance and perfect our nature. He says the demand for performance and perfection animates our impulse to rail against any given. I think Sandel's observation is so important for the church and for parachurch organizations, for community organizations. I've noticed that sometimes in the church, here's our pattern, we take people who are already too busy in their life, ask them to join us, and then finish them off with more things to do. We're sometimes tempted to make various kinds of Christian busyness some sort of substitute for worshiping God, and it can never be. Lord's Day rest, when and where we acknowledge who and whose we are. That can change your life. Life-giving rest, filled with thanksgiving to the one who did what needed done, that can breathe life back into you. Praise to God for the one who was born in obscurity, crucified tragically, and who rose unexpectedly. Well, that's a life-giving witness in a world that goes 24/7. People in their personal lives and our planet are paying the cost for a kind of restless busyness that knows no measure of success except for more productivity, more GDP, more results. The energizing center of Christian activity in the church and in the world is worship. We can't give what we haven't received. Martha seizes the moment and she receives what Jesus has to give her. Luke says Mary sat at Jesus' feet and listened to his teaching. Mary, a friend of Jesus, has become Mary, a disciple of Jesus. Right? Sensing he's on his way to Jerusalem, Mary actually breaks with polite social custom and practice. She, a woman, sits at a rabbi's feet. Such a practice was unknown in the ancient world. Rabbis didn't have female disciples, but opened the door to Jesus, and a moment of rest becomes countercultural. On the other hand, did you notice that Jesus' visit just makes Martha mad? Martha was distracted. She appeals to Jesus' sense of fair play. Don't you care that I have to do everything alone? Ever heard that? Ever said that? She's anxious and troubled about many things. Martha is all aflutter. Like many doers, Martha is better at giving than receiving. Martha's the kind of person, I know her, she gets twitchy if she's not multitasking. She has an agenda and will bang things around to get control of the situation. Her good works, well, they've become a misery to her and a tyranny to everybody else. She is what Oscar Wilde once says, a good person in the worst sense of the term. She wants Mary to get with her program. She'll even use Jesus to do it. Martha is not so much called as Martha is driven, and God be merciful to people who get in her way. The Bible is too respectful to say it, but she's miffed with Jesus. Surely Jesus knows how hospitality works, she thinks. I'm the host, he's the hosted. I have something to give to Jesus. And then Jesus says, relax. And then something interesting happens. The host becomes the hosted. The giver becomes the receiver. And the Marthas of this world have a very, very hard time being a receiver. In the early 1980s, I attended a Christian college in Chicago. And every year at that college, we all got a PCW assignment, practical Christian work. Some people taught Sunday school, some of us were youth workers, served in city missions. But one year my assignment was to go to a senior's home and help a woman in her 90s clean her apartment. I arrived ready to help, all dressed in work clothes. I said, hey, do you want me to climb up there, get the top of those cupboards? Where's the vacuum? Where do I start, I asked, like a good Martha. She said, oh, never mind all of that. Come and sit down here and watch The Price is Right with me. So each week for 6 months, we watched Bob Barker and The Price is Right. Come on down. When the assignment was over, her apartment was as dirty as it was at the beginning, but she offered me an envelope. Inside was $5. We were told we shouldn't take any payment from people. And so I said, thank you very much, but I can't take any of your money. You know, it can make a person feel all self-sufficient, declining a gift and giving it back. Sometimes refusing a gift is more of an expression of power than charity. Maybe that's why I refused it. I thought, listen, I'm better off than this poor woman living alone. That's when she said to me, all 4'11" of her, oh, stop it, she said, young man, don't be too proud to receive a gift. Oh, wasn't expecting that. It is awkward to receive from someone. It's humbling to take a gift from another person. For fixers and doers in a performance-oriented meritocracy like Canada, it's downright awkward. See, because when you take a gift, it indebts you. It cuts away your self-sufficiency as the sham that it really is, and it shows up your dependence. And the Marthas of this world, the self-made men and women, the self-made people of the world have a hard time, a really hard time with that. We can get so busy, so exhausted, finishing our things to do list, that we forget, as Martha did, that we need Jesus' words. His words are like life to our lives. They're like food to our souls. He has grace and peace to speak to us. And in the place of our busy, distracted, and turbulent service, Mary alerts us to stop, to look, to listen. For it is in the stillness of sitting and receiving at the feet of Jesus that our lives are energized for service. And it will be service that won't be spoiled by self-pity and self-concern. In conclusion, some years ago, Martin Luther King Jr.'s father, Daddy King, traveled to Harvard Memorial Church to offer the sermon at a memorial service for his son. When he came to the pulpit, he stood there and the crowd applauded loudly. Every time he tried to speak into the microphone, they applauded again. He just stood there for a while at the microphone, waiting for the applause to subside. Finally, he held up his hand, and just above the applause, he said this: "I don't deserve it. I can't refuse it. I know it's for my boy." Don't waste the gift of the grace of Jesus Christ. We don't deserve it, but we can't refuse it. He set his face toward Jerusalem, and Jesus shared his life with two sisters. One was a generous receiver. She chose the good portion, the one thing needful. God give us the grace and the humility to do the same. Amen.